What's up, fellow tubers? It's been another year and a few months. 2021 was, let's call it an adventure, full of drama in the public domain and privately. Through it all, there are three things that keep me going: God, family, and video games. As usual, I'm sharing the fun side of my 2021 in hopes it'll brighten all your days, with the top 10 games I played last year and a couple of weeks into January. Number 10. One of the hazards of being a student of game design is sometimes when you expand your horizons, you stumble upon something that becomes a little more attention absorbing than you'd prefer it to be. I watched one video about idle games, and the next thing I know, 2 years has gone by. So what's the appeal? It's just a simple free-to-play idle game, right? Take Civilization, boil it down to its most basic elements, find an optimal build, execute, and leave it alone for a few days before collecting your earnings, and repeat, right? To tell the truth, it isn't any more complicated than that. But boiling down the resource management of such games into its purest form, mixed with free-to-play style real-life timers, can be terrifyingly addicting. There's a near-perfect ratio of hands-on to hands-off with each individual objective type, so that it's entirely viable to either pop in for a few seconds every couple of hours, or actively rotate between tasks while other objective types finish their timer to optimize your profits. Early to mid-game, there's always something cool to work towards, and there's several different avenues of investment to be made so you can multitask each round to maximize your rate of improvement. Plus, there is an actual endgame that I won't spoil for anyone surprisingly interested in the game after this video. But it's really cool for what kind of game this is. Territory Idol is a weird case, but I legitimately had more fun with this congregate level indie game than I did with some of the real games I played this year. Number 9. Speaking of said real games, we're discussing the next two games in an unorthodox manner, because it's a tie! I scratched a lot of big names off the bucket list this year, but unfortunately, most of them didn't live up to the hype in my opinion, or at the very least, they didn't click for me personally. These two in particular fared the best, and that's partially because they complemented each other to such a degree that I appreciated them each more for having played the other. Super Metroid does live up to a lot of the hype when it comes to atmospheric design. Everything from the pirate base appearing abandoned up until it isn't, to the in-game no-dialogue tutorials with the local wildlife, to the gruesome tug-of-war that is the Crocomire fight, to the derelict ship that is haunted by literal space ghosts, all the way to that ending with a baby Metroid and Mother Brain. The attention to detail means so much more than 1,000 lines of dialogue. Where Super Metroid falls short is in the gameplay department. It's incredibly clunky to control. The game's signature wall jumping, for example, requires a spin jump and an execution-heavy directional input before you press the jump button a second time. Don't get me wrong, I really appreciate just how much sequence breaking wall jumping allows for. It expands the replayability of the game in a way that few other games offer, but it's by no means a mechanic I want to use just because it feels good. The combat isn't much better. Normal enemies exist more as level hazards than strategic engagements, and it's only during boss fights, giant damage sponges that they are, where it's worth taking the time to use the charge shots before the attack patterns get too erratic and you're forced to use the quicker, more maneuverable super missiles. I'll begrudgingly acknowledge, realizing how much easier this makes the fights after dying to Ridley and Mother Brain half a dozen times was incredibly satisfying, but it doesn't make up for how tedious the rest of the combat encounters are. Meanwhile, Outland is linear, composed of unchanging, abstract backgrounds. What little story it has interrupts the flow of the game with occasional exposition dumps, and none of the additional move upgrades are optional. It also has accessible, satisfying movement mechanics. Look at that! I jumped at the wall, and then I pressed the jump button again, so I jumped again. Oh my gosh! It has a combat system that, though simple, has a variety of engaging mechanics to mix things up during a regular encounter. The hero can dash kick, drop kick, knock into the air, stun slash, energy beam, and absorb nearby enemy attacks to do a spirit bomb. Then there's Outland's gimmick, which is equal parts beautiful and frustrating. Swapping between light and dark so that you don't take damage from the same type, can hit the opposite type, and can interact with structures of the same color. Essentially, it's another one of those genre mashups I find so fascinating. In this case, shoot 'em up and Metroidvania. Considering how bad I am at it, I'm not in a hurry to try more shoot 'em ups, but weaving through these intricate patterns while changing as needed presents a unique kind of challenge that elevates these basic platforming segments to something more memorable. And all these patterns made up of various mixes of the two colors adds a visual flair that makes up for the lack of background details. All those mechanics, platforming, combat, and color swapping, mesh together to create some really fun and creative bosses that I'd happily fight again, and probably the best final boss I fought all year. Even now, writing this script, well past the beginning of 2022, I can't decide which one of these I like more. If you twist my arm, I'll say Super Metroid. But again, only because the positives of its atmosphere and sequence breaking are highlighted by being the only things that Outland really lacks. So yeah, ¿por qué no los dos? Both is good. Number 7. Next up, it's the best pre-Breath of the Wild Zelda. I'm not sorry. Seriously though, if you're a Zelda fan who hasn't given Okami a shot yet, you are really missing out. So much of this game is Zelda with a new coat of paint, adding polish and removing jank. Like, remember all those old Zeldas where running is so slow and boring that people just mash the roll button to break up the monotony? Well, in Okami, the longer Amaterasu maintains forward momentum, her speed increases, and the loping stride of her walking animation gradually transitions from simply kicking up dust to leaving a trail of flowers blooming in her wake. Or how about the Celestial Brush techniques, that are, when you break it down, just reskins of several staple Zelda items, except 1. How you come across the Celestial Guardians is far more cohesively integrated into the story, and 2. The brush techniques cut out all the inventory fiddling. Sure, you still have to pause the game to use them, but after that, you're done. The item is already doing what it needs to do without pausing to change your shoes every 5 seconds. Character-wise, my personal feelings about Zelda probably skew my judgment, but to me, Isen is a funnier, more likable companion than everyone besides Midna, and the B-plot surrounding the legendary warrior Susanoo is such a wonderful parody of Zelda's narrative tropes, in which you essentially play Zelda covering for a boastful, lazy version of Link, who is not nearly as cool as he thinks he is. Meanwhile, the combat's still got that attack, wait, attack, wait flavor baked into it, but there's a whole extra game loop involving free shields for doing damage without taking damage, and better loot for mixing up your strategy. All that, wrapped in a gorgeous watercolor art style, elevates this from a copycat to a must-play alternative to 3D Zelda. Number 6. The next game is a bit of a long story. A tall tale. You might even say it's an epic yarn. After Yoshi's Woolly World surprised me with just how good it was last year, I decided it was time to finally make time in my schedule to play Kirby's Epic Yarn, and it did not disappoint. Admittedly, in addition to the subtle differences in Yarn Kirby and Yarn Yoshi gameplay, there's also a noticeable difference in presentation of the yarn-based aesthetic, where Yoshi inhabited a giant art room re-envisioned from the perspective of three-dimensional plushies. Kirby's characters are made from a handful of strings forming outlines, which move about on a two-dimensional printed backdrop. This doesn't really matter from a gameplay perspective, but visually it leads to a lot more sight gags, like the reason Kirby's moveset has changed. Dynamic stage transitions where the applique elements that make the foreground rearrange themselves to create new landscapes, and the smaller, more sequin-like beads being placed directly onto the backdrop to decorate it. One of my favorite set pieces is where thematically colored beads are used to decorate a snowy landscape for Christmas. Speaking of the beads, there's more to them than aesthetics. There's a very real Sonic the Hedgehog trying to keep from losing your rings before the next checkpoint aspect to collecting them that admittedly helps add some tension where it would be otherwise lacking, seeing as you can't really die. Personally speaking, I prefer a platformer with lighter penalties for missed jumps, so it doesn't bother me, and actually I was a little impressed with how, despite the game's reputation, there were jumps I had to put some real skill behind just to progress directly through the various levels before even considering 100% completion. Which again, this is a Kirby game. If the main campaign isn't challenging for you, completing the apartment decoration quest unlocks some fun and challenging missions, including Escort and Hide and Seek. Considering Epic Yarn came before Woolly World, it admittedly feels like a story I've heard before. But sometimes it's nice to hear Grandpa Kirby tell that story again, while wrapped up in one of Grandma's knitted blankets. Number 5. After playing Reciteer for a bit back in the day, I checked out other games by the same company, and that's how I found Fortune Summoner's Secret of the Elemental Stones. It doesn't have the same hook of running an item shop, but it does have the same tone and sensibilities. Even when the game starts dramatically raising the stakes, the narrative arcs are very much a card captor style of young magical girls fighting Saturday morning cartoon villains. However, the primary selling point and differentiating factor from Reciteer is the combat. Fortune Summoners is actually a hardcore action RPG that has motion inputs reminiscent of a fighting game, and every character needs to keep in mind spacing, blocking, and hitboxes. It's my first step towards facing this kind of execution barrier, and while I found myself constantly frustrated when whiffing moves, I have to admit I enjoy the tactical challenge inherent in deciding which move would actually hit the target, let alone do the most damage. Seriously, considering Archie's only aerial attacks are standing up slash, swing while jumping, and this very tedious to time downward stab, the one section where she had to face an onslaught of sleep-inducing bees by herself was more irritating than the most incessant random encounters I have ever faced. The game does put that frustration to good use though, because once you've experienced the feelings of helplessness and loneliness without your mage teammates, moments involving growing stronger through friendship are much more believable. Plus, stomping all over the bees and other flying enemies as you expand your mage powers turns simple backtracking into sweet revenge. One final highlight is the weird leveling system, where the level cap only increases if you go out of your way to pick up these marks of heroism, which not only gives the game a Zelda-esque reward system for exploration, but also opens the potential for low level runs. I'd probably put it in the top 3 games I played this year, if not for the unfortunate fact that my setup lagged significantly during the playthrough. But the fact that I still put it this high despite that speaks for itself. Number 4. Pinball is one of my all-time favorite classic arcade genres. But ever since I experienced the more exotic mechanics digital pinball games like Pokemon Pinball and Metroid Prime Pinball allow, I've yearned for a game that expounds on the possibilities that might come from combining pinball mechanics with other genres. It's not as if there isn't precedent for this idea of mixing up arcade mechanics with meatier, more story-heavy and secondary gameplay loop-focused experiences when you consider the likes of Necrodancer, Final Fantasy Dissidia, and Puzzle Quest. Enter Yoku's Island Express, which is so well executed even though it's clearly designed with pinball mechanics in mind. If you took the pinball gimmick out, I'd say it could be reworked into a pretty solid Metroidvania. It's not as open-ended as the likes of Super Metroid. The story is too rigid and the pinball mechanics are slightly magnetized, so even novices can feel like pros pulling off slick pinball tricks. However, there are sequence breaks for those with the skill to achieve them, and an additional mechanic to the game that opens routing to player choice through toll flippers that are activated by paying a certain number of fruit acquired via exploration. From an environmental perspective, the island has so many varied nooks and crannies to open, filled with lore and visual set pieces and wacky island natives. The best showcase of all of this melding together is the fast travel system called the Beeline. It's opened up with quests using the fruit economy, allowing you to zoom across the island stupidly fast, controlled with the basic flipper mechanics, and all without giving Yoku himself an upgrade that breaks the game. In place of power-ups, the game has these colorful pinballs you can swap out, mostly for fashion, but they do act as context-sensitive hall passes to certain areas. I kind of wish there was a pinball-style scoring system, but considering the only consequences for death is this ominous death count, it probably wouldn't work. Oh well. I've got a few more deliveries to run, so let's get on with it. Number 3. Pre-fight setup is one of the most underdeveloped aspects of JRPGs. So when I hear there's a game that has that, and the characters all speak in rhyme, that's all I needed to know to add Child of Light to my backlog. The story is an awkward yet enchanting mishmash of historical events, fairy tales, and an Alice in Wonderland dreams made real coming-of-age scheme, which surprisingly managed to stir my emotions a bit, despite the rushed runtime stunting character development. A likely explanation for its power is the gorgeous art style, which depicts characters ranging from the fair folk, to Red Wall-inspired talking animals, to these Dr. Seuss-style fish that are all going glurk. The combat is a bonkers mix of Paper Mario, Rayman, and a special variation of an active time battle system. You fly around a side-scrolling map, freely collecting fireflies the way you collect Lums in Rayman. You can surprise enemies before a fight the way you do in Paper Mario, and it takes the conditional turn-based approach of letting you see each character's turn order, but has them move along the queue in real time, like an active time battle system. So even though the combat revolves around carefully choosing which actions will get you ahead in the turn order, there's still a tremendous sense of pressure to constantly be performing actions, even when the game has paused to let you decide which move to make on your turn, because now you have to balance damage, status effects, and winning the race against the enemy's casting time. A point of personal satisfaction comes from the fact that status effects have meaningful value up to and even working on boss fights. If that's still too simple for you, the gimmick for this game is this firefly who can slow down an enemy to strategically get ahead of them, but uses a meter that needs to be refilled by potions or these glowing plants that slowly recharge throughout the fight. The cherry on top is the gem crafting system. It's straightforward and doesn't really have much depth to its gameplay loops, but it really satisfies my OCD desire to min-max. Child of Light is not a grand, full package RPG, but like a good bedtime story, its impact outshines its short runtime. Number 2. A few years ago, you might remember I gave high praise to a little game called Breath of the Wild. So it shouldn't surprise you when Nintendo tells me they're taking the characters and setting from that game and handing those over to the Hyrule Warriors team to make another flashy hack-and-slash game. My response is, shut up and take my money. Of course, the marketing team continued to capitalize on the widespread misconception that Zelda is a story-driven franchise, so I went into the game expecting some narrative shenanigans that would end up disappointing. The game starts with a time-traveling robot. So, I was definitely right about it being disappointing from a certain point of view. But for me, it was rather refreshing, and had one of the best climaxes in the series. Not going to say more, because... spoilers. As to the gameplay, the basics are fairly standard Musou-style, single-button combos that branch off into different finishers. I especially love how Rivali's kit involves flying over the battlefield, carpet bombing everything, and how Zelda's moveset is just spam Breath of the Wild's runes. Regardless, the real highlight for Age of Calamity is how it used Breath of the Wild's coolest mechanics and set pieces to refine Hyrule Warriors' fusion of Zelda and Musou. The runes replace the highly situational items with a streamlined Simon Says parry system for that sweet stun and defense break action, while also introducing a whole bunch of defensive and mobility options you can fairly reliably use on the fly. Likewise, they solved Breath of the Wild's biggest problem, a whole bag full of disposable weapons and resources, with the weapon forging system and the overworld's Hyrule construction missions. The forges let you consolidate that pile of excess weapons into new weapons that accumulate all those skills and stats. Meanwhile, all the character upgrades in Age of Calamity come with a little story about how whatever character involved is either participating in a cross-cultural exchange, going on some in-character journey of self-improvement to learn a new move, or reinforcing their territory for the Calamity War. Finally, there's the big gameplay element like nothing in Warriors or Zelda.
Megazord Online.
Ah yeah, we finally get to pilot the Divine Beasts, burninating the countryside and burninating the peasants, stomping all over what would be a day's journey across a vast region in Breath of the Wild in a matter of seconds. Age of Calamity might not deliver everything we hoped for in the prequel to Breath of the Wild, but it was one of the funnest games I played in 2021. It's time for honorable mentions! This year, I finally knuckled down to play through all 3 games in the Insane Trilogy. I had loads of fun smashing boxes and collecting gems, but between Crash 1's insanely low margin for error and the disappointing reward for completing Crash 2, I don't think this franchise is for me. Xenoblade Chronicles. As a testament to how long some games have been sitting in my backlog, I've had a Wii copy of this game sitting around since before the 3DS version was a thing. I'm very impressed they managed to fit this on the Wii. And the combat has some cool ideas if you're into MMO cooldown rotation gameplay. But the big plot twists are massive turnoffs for me, so I had to drop it. Final Fantasy VII. Now that I've seen what all the fuss is about, I can acknowledge the game is technically impressive. There is so much going on between the story, the combat, the side quests, and the world itself. I could gush for days about the environmental storytelling delivered by the differences between a Plate 7 shack and a Rocket Town Rambler with a bathroom. Unfortunately, the story dropped off hard after Midgard, and for all the potential variety the materia system provides, there was still a lot of sitting back and watching a summon do its thing. That said, Final Fantasy VII does represent the blueprints for what I'm looking for in a large-scale adventure, and I'm glad to have experienced it. Number 1! Does open water make you uneasy? Are you afraid of the dark? Which terrifies you more? The prospect of what might lurk beyond our solar system, or right here in our own backyard? Maybe you're like me, and that trepidation is mixed with admiration for the beauty of creation. If any of that's too much for you, though, it's time to get off the boat, because for the final entry, we're going on a nautical adventure. Subnautical. I played Subnautica on the grounds of being an ocean-themed Minecraft built on a world map that was designed with progression and discovery in mind, rather than procedurally generated. And it delivered more than I could have expected. The construction mechanics don't necessarily live up to the versatility or depth of Minecraft. Buildings are way too picky about where you place them, and I could do with more decoration options, but the novelty of building vehicles goes a long way towards making up for that. The Seamoth's obviously my favorite, because underwater, omnidirectional, fast movement is basically flying. Meanwhile, the prawn suit doesn't offer as much mobility, but it radically shifts how you interact with the world in an interesting way, and provides a convenient late-game mining system. What's made Subnautica stick with me all year, however, is the terrific atmosphere of awe-inspiring and desperate survival. From the very beginning, you're constantly having to contend with hunger, thirst, and especially that pesky need to breathe. If you want to expand your tool set to make survival easier, or just plain scrounge up the resources to build your underwater vacation home, you'll have to venture further and further into the abyss. Through a combination of technical limitations and intentional design, you'll never know if the underwater landscape just beyond your field of view is a new safe haven to park your next base, or a no man's land full of hostile leviathans. Which is made all the worse by how laughably pathetic your offensive options are. Even after you've learned all the game's tricks and realize how easy it is to avoid confrontation with the baddies, you're constantly looking over your shoulder, making sure you haven't accidentally wandered into something aggressive's territory. Which actually leads to an incredibly satisfying story. It's not shoved in your face, and it's something you actively have to explore and piece together through scanning local wildlife, archaeological sites, and abandoned spacecraft as you gradually work out why your spaceship crashed on this planet and what you're going to have to do to escape it. This year, I played a lot of games, and yet Subnautica's survival gameplay, sci-fi oceanic aesthetic, and exploration-based unfurling story were so compelling that literally every water level I played before and afterward, not to mention videos of the real world, were compared to the haunting beauty of those undersea horizons. And there you have it! How many of these have you heard of before? Virtually all the games that make it onto these lists is from first playthroughs, and with my backlog as big as it is, I'm always behind the times. So it's incredibly cool when I manage to share a new perspective on something everyone else has already played, or dig up a hidden gem not a lot of people are talking about. If nothing else, I hope it was entertaining. With that, I hope to put out more stuff this year, and maybe see a lot more people on this channel. But I've learned not to make promises with this business, so for now, I'll just say, see ya when I see ya.